Can you guys see my screen?
Looking good from my side.
Okay, cool.
So you can see it.
Cool. So, okay. Well, I'm Dinesh. We work at Lumkani. We're going to speak a little bit about that, but essentially we're going to talk about our Vue architecture and how we build a custom Vue API for our components. In this talk, we will cover the problems that we faced, how we solved, and how to build a custom plugin that was part of our solution. So starting about Lumkani, Lumkani is a social enterprise based here in Cape Town. Our main focus is we develop products for financial inclusion for previously disadvantaged people. And one of those, and actually how the company started, is IoT network connected fire detector for informal settlements. You can see the picture on the side, it's this one. Part of our operation depends on agent network, which are people that work in the community and they have their own app to manage our clients. And this app is built on top of Vue and Quasar. No? So as I mentioned, we used Quasar to build the app. We only support Android, and Quasar give us the ability to build the app using Cordova. And it also allows us to build using the same code base web version of the app, which is actually used by our call center agents, because we have agents in field and also that manage calls and remote works, things like that. Cool. Going to the interesting part, I would say. Those are the three main problems that we faced. First, the lack of standards. The way that we experienced is that usually lack of standards can make things hard to develop. Like developers in general spend more time thinking about like, where do I put this code? Where is this code? Where can I find that? As opposed to actually solving the business issue, the business problem. I think the other two are kind of related to the lack of standards as well, because if you don't really have a standard to write your code, can be very difficult to write tests, unit tests. Yeah, different tests require different boilerplates, different setups. Can be quite tricky to set up the environment, I would say. And usually, if it's hard to test, people tend not to do it, right? It won't have much love in the tests. That's like that. So it then will be not as valuable, hard to maintain, all the downsides of that. And I think the third thing was that it was very hard to onboard people. If you don't have a standard, people tend to take longer to ramp up, especially in our case, because we were working with remote people at the time. Back, like they were 5 hours behind us, working in Brazil, from Brazil. So yeah, that was part of our problems as well. Cool. Yeah. So how did we solve? Now I think that's the important thing. Well, okay. Cool. I think just to give some history, you know, how we got to this point, like back in 2014 to 2016, I was still working back in Brazil. And the company that I was working for, we were using AngularJS at that time. And we kind of had some good separation there. So the inspiration came from how we split the code, the business logic from the AngularJS context. So that was kind of what inspired this. I'm gonna try to explain this now. So as you can see here, there is some common Vue.js code, just a iteration in a list of items and just a method add item. And we kind of wanted to find a standard way and improve our project structure, like folder structure, naming conventions, all that stuff. And also to split the business logic just to be in pure JS, and that the logic wouldn't know that was being used by Vue or in a blue sky way, any other framework, that you could replace the Vue layer with any other framework. Yeah, I mentioned this history. I think this is just a structure that we use there. For those familiar with AngularJS, would have the module name, but actually what is more interesting is that the logic would be in the model file. I think that's why we call ViewModel in this case. Yeah. Cool. So we had a couple of iterations, and the first one was essentially splitting the code. So we created a class, can also just be a normal object. And we created the add item method here, and we imported on the Vue component as a object, and we just proxy, was basically a proxy to the logic, where we would pass the context as the first parameter and all the other parameters in sequence. I think from that, what we got as a benefit was like we had a more solid structure in how everything should be placed. And so this is kind of the structure that we got. We would have always a component name, the view file, the logic, and the test. So for our test, it got way simpler. We didn't need to mount Vue or even Vuex. We were using Vuex at that time to manage our state. You could essentially just import the object, pass another object as a context that is essentially the data from the Vue component. It would be the same. So that makes it a lot easier to test. Yeah, but we still had some stuff that we didn't like much. For example, if you had more methods, you would need to kind of add them, map them manually. Like, for example, if you have add item, you would add item and so on for the others. Same with mounted and the other hooks. In our case, because we were also using Vuex, if we wanted to not using the code that already existed, we would need to rewrite completely, which we wouldn't have time for that. Like we would never make it a priority. And the same for validate. We would also need to rewrite that. It would be a bit tricky. Yeah, I think you want to start on this part, Shaven?
Yeah. So maybe if
Should I
you have
stop
some
sharing?
questions for Dinesh at this point in time, I think that would be a great idea.
Sorry?
Skulk, is there any questions for Dinesh at this
Yes,
point?
so there is in fact one. It is what made the tests difficult?
Sorry?
What is it that made the tests difficult?
For example, part of our code, like regarding the business logic, which is what we wanted to test, sometimes the code would be partially would be in Vuex, like the logic would be in the actions. Sometimes would be in the Vue component itself. Sometimes kind of in both. It would just make the not very standard way to test, and we needed more boilerplate to set up the tests. Not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, okay, let me just see. Well, okay. Yeah. Anything else?
Not at the moment, but so yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can just put them in the Spectrum link that I shared, and I'll ask them as we go.
Cool.
Cool. Dinesh, I guess I can share my screen from here.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, so Dinesh, thanks Dinesh. So basically up until this point, Dinesh came up with the initial idea, or was inspired by what he did at Viva Decora. So that's basically what we've implemented in the first iteration. So then the second iteration, after we had worked on the first one, Dinesh and I just felt like there was just too much duplication involved. There was too much proxying of the methods or computed properties and that kind of thing. So I went home the weekend at that point, and then basically it was like all I could think of, like how can I solve some of the duplication. So then that's when I figured maybe let's build a layer that converts the ViewModel API to the options API. So basically it'll take this object, or in the case of what we're doing, is it's a class, but this is the same way of writing it. So it's basically just a flavor of the options API, you could say, where the first argument of all functions is just the view context. So we would basically write our pages or our components using the this interface, and then build a plugin, which we called the ViewModel plugin, that would basically transform our interface into the options API, which Vue is familiar with or understands what to do. Yeah, so that is the second iteration. So basically this version supported data, methods, computed and mounted only. And basically the plugin was packaged within our code base, so the application code base. yeah, this is the second one. And then the third iteration was like the official version 1 of the plugin. So we basically made a standalone package, which is available on NPM. We open sourced the plugin. We added support for Vuex and some of our like internal packages that we used, like Validate, which is just a validation library. And then this version has to be used with a bundler like Webpack or Rollup or something of that sort. So this is like the style that we basically wrote our components in. So all the logic was basically abstracted into this new interface. And then we would write our, here's an example of us using Vuex or abstracting away some of the boilerplate of using Vuex within a component. I just didn't like was it the map state, map actions and that kind of thing. So this basically does all that for you. And then the fourth iteration was a massive change, and mainly this iteration of the plugin, we worked quite hard on this one because there was actually people that started using the package outside of Lumkani. And then I figured that, okay, we can't have any Lumkani like specific stuff in the plugin. So now we need to abstract away a lot of the things that's not necessarily available in Vue or that's specific to us. I mean, so basically the team that we started working with from Brazil, a few of the developers on that team started using the plugin for their own personal projects. And from what I've heard, that the team, which is a dev house, started using the plugin for some smaller projects for some of their clients, from what I've heard. Yeah, so we wrote the plugin from the ground up, better project setup with linting and unit tests. We are actually, accidentally, we were able to get 100% coverage. Version 3 is now available via the CDN. So you can use the plugin just through a normal script tag. So you can use it in the browser. We developed something called the Modifiers API, which I'll go through in a bit. We have documentation for it now. And then in this version, we have like no non-Vue concepts included. So we don't bundle things like Vuex or a Vue routing or any of that kind of things into this plugin anymore. So we have abstracted all of that stuff out. I can actually take you to the repo. Yeah, so this is the repo. It's under the Lumkani namespace. Here's the documentation. So you guys can check that out. I'll share this a bit later. Here's a demo on CodePen as well. I'll go through that now actually in a bit. Yeah, so we got a pretty good repository setup. We have the tests, we have the plugin. I can show some of the plugin code for anyone who's interested. Yeah, so this is like the plugin itself that manages the conversion for us to the options API. Yeah, so I'll be explaining, eventually I'm going to be talking about how to build your own plugin for whatever reason you would like. Maybe you want to abstract some common logic away, or maybe start sharing some packages across multiple teams that use Vue, or just things like that. So here's an example of the code. Yeah, so it's basically just like a to-do app. Everyone starts off with a to-do app, I guess. Yeah, so we basically just author our code in this class, and you can see it does the data, creates the data here. There's the add to do method here as well. So the context is injected with the VM. So we get the VM as the context, or the Vue instance. Yeah, so this should work. React. Cool. And then we just pass the view model or whatever view model to the view options API, and then we'll do the conversion for us basically. Yeah. Oh, where's my slides? Yeah. Is there any questions so far, perhaps? Skulk?
So there's one from my side, which is how many times did you iterate over this pattern? And how different is this from, I assume, what you initially attempted? Given that in my experience, it kind of takes a couple of iterations to kind of fine tune these type of setups.
There's actually not much of a difference really. I think the iterations itself is mainly the evolution of the plugin itself, not necessarily the evolution of the concept, if that makes sense. Yeah, because I'm not too sure how to explain really. But yeah, most of the development went into mainly the plugin itself and getting together that. But I think the approach was, for example, the first iteration only supported, if I just go back, the first iteration only supported, yes, I remember. So that the first iteration only, we're only like abstracting away methods in that case. So the classes would look very different. It would look something like this. Actually, yeah, it would look something like this with just methods on a class, static mounted for the lifecycle hooks. There was no real like one-to-one map with the options API, the actual API that Vue uses for creating components. And then in the second iteration, that's when I decided to basically copy what Vue does, but in the same way. So then it would have become add item like this. Yeah. And then, for example, if you wanted a computed property, it would be like this as well. So it's a one-to-one map, basically, between the Vue options API and then this one. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, that makes sense. I mean, like, not like saying there wasn't a lot of iteration is still an answer.
I think that maybe before we had a lot of iterations trying to use Vuex and or other stuff before creating our own. I think we had more iterations on that side than actually after we started the plugin. I would say.
Yeah, you're right, Dinesh, you're right.
We tried a lot to do the separation using Vuex. I don't know if you remember, Shayla. Yeah.
Yes, I remember. Yeah, so now it's basically like one-to-one. If something exists in Vue, it's as simple as just saying, okay, static watch. Okay, I want to watch name if it exists on data, and then you can do that. It's just that the difference is that the first argument is always the context of whatever framework is being used, or yeah, whatever's being used. Yeah.
So then another question from my side: how much of this, if not the actual code itself, maybe more the concept, how much of this is kind of Vue agnostic? And do you ever see kind of implementations of this outside of Vue?
Well, this specific concept or whatever we've worked on.
Yeah, the approach.
Yes, Dinesh actually used a similar approach with the team that he worked on at Viva Decora, if I'm not mistaken, Dinesh.
Yes. It was just harder to, AngularJS was a bit harder to completely eliminate, let's say, the smell of AngularJS. But yeah, we used very similar approach back then. But I don't really know how much, like, we didn't really think much in like, we want to replace the framework one day. I would say, I think it was more the idea that Vue is very good in the view, like DOM manipulation, things like that. So
Yeah.
we tried to keep the Vue framework there, and the logic we didn't want to see the view, but now the UI view smell in the business logic, because we don't really need, right? We wanted to have this separation of concerns, let's say, like that.
Yeah, there's something that I think that that might be a bit helpful as well. For example, maybe this will be a bit more of an extension on your question, Skulk. Is that I noticed a lot of the Vue code that I have seen, typically components. Let's say you have methods, right? And then you have a method called add item. And then you have the item, and then let's say that there's some logic here to add to an array. Add to an array. And then, for example, let's say you want to do some processing on the array, before you like add it to the actual array. Return, it's just a hypothetical example. Then what I've seen a lot is that stuff like this. So this dot process array item, and then add to array, for example. So for example, something like this, and this is actually a big issue with Vue 2 in general, and this is one of the reasons why there's been a push to using the composition API, because what happens now is that the template, for example, might need or needs add item as a method to use from the template side, but the template doesn't actually need process array as a method. So what happens is the template itself now has access to this logic, which in most cases it doesn't really need. So you get like this issue of like, it just becomes bloated. Most Vue components are extremely bloated from what I've seen. So basically, there's no like abstraction or, okay, we can move this out from the view and maybe make it separate, if you know what I mean. Yeah, something like this. And then let's just use this here directly. Yeah, things like that. So this approach really helps with doing that kind of stuff as well.
So we have a question by Michael as well. Like he said, he's keen to ask it via audio. Do you want to go ahead, Mike?
Yeah, sure. How's it, gents? So my question is a little bit more just high level. I think that it was kind of covered in Skulk's last question. But in terms of like a high level, like are the wins here mainly about separating your concerns out, just so that it becomes kind of easier to maintain and to work on separate pieces together? Or is it more of like a performance thing, or is it like a scaling thing? Like where if you were to implement this approach into a project, where would the biggest wins come in terms of like where the value it adds?
So I think Dinesh and I, we might have maybe a bit of a differing opinion. But from my side, from what I can say, is the biggest win that I've experienced with this approach by far is obviously like we don't have to think like too much about where things go anymore. We know exactly where things are, so we can find things much more easily. We've adopted a lot of the approaches from the Vue style guide, which you can, I don't know if you guys have seen that. I think my browser just froze. But anyway, yeah, so like just finding things, the organization of stuff. And then the biggest win is by far testing, just generally like writing tests, unit tests, anything to do with testing. This approach has really helped a lot because if you've written tests for like Vue components, and if your logic is encapsulated in Vue components, then what needs to happen is really you need to mount the component. So you need to set up, I feel like you need to set up quite a bit of boilerplate just to maybe test one method that doesn't really need to do anything with the view, you know. And in most cases, the Vue utils documentation emphasizes testing things like did the list render correctly, or is the items that actually rendered in the list correct? Which in our case is not really an issue because we trust that those things are rendered correctly in that situation. So personally, I would say testing is probably the biggest win from this approach. Dinesh, do you have anything to add, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Testing and all the rest, yeah. And I also think that even like for me it was very nice to be able to onboard people more easily, you know. Because now we have more tests, and the tests are also easier to read because you go straight to the logic, right? As Shaivan said, you don't need to set up that whole shell around your test. So people that are not familiar with that project or that code, they can more easily find how things work. And because it's kind of a thin layer on top of Vue, it's very easy to make a written documentation. So we have, I think it was very efficient way to give to the other developers back in Brazil, for example, they just read very quickly the concepts and the ideas in the written documentation. And as developers, we always like to see code, and they could just jump in the unit test, and that also act as documentation in how to use and where to add things. And yeah, I think it created a nice standard across the code base. I think that was something that helped me a lot, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Cool, Michael. Thanks. Great
Thanks,
question.
man.
So there's two more questions, but maybe you guys can just proceed, and then we can maybe loop back to some other questions a bit later.
Cool. Yeah, so let me get back. Where was I? Yeah, the fourth iteration. Yeah, so I guess like we found a lot of what's the word? A lot of benefit in open sourcing the project and making it available to other developers. And surprisingly, people have used it for their own personal projects so far. They actually discovered bugs and things that we were not aware of, which was very nice as well. So that helped us improve the project. So I guess the step that I wanted to go in now is how can you, as someone on a team working with Vue, or maybe you have multiple projects using Vue, how can you build a plugin to just help your team, or abstract common things that your team is using, or just to make something that just seems very boilerplate-ish a lot more simpler, or simplify the interface for it. So basically what I'm going to go through now is like how to build your own plugin, and the concepts behind it and what you really need to know. Yeah, so I just have a very simple Vue setup. I just used the normal Vue CLI to create it. If you guys aren't familiar, yeah, you just say Vue create and it'll spin up the project for you. So this is what it looks like. Can I move this thing? Sorry. Okay, cool. Can you see?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so if you haven't developed a plugin, or like if you haven't taken the time to understand some of the core things of how Vue really works, plugins might seem a bit scary, but in actual fact, building Vue plugins aren't that difficult at all. So basically, we can start off with just like creating a plugin.js file. And then what we can do is we can just import, we don't actually have to import Vue, we can build the plugin directly here. So what we can do is we can just create like this plugin object. And all you need to do is the object needs to have an install method. And the first argument is the Vue constructor. And basically, that's really the boilerplate for the plugin itself. So we can import it into the main JS file. Plugin. And then from here, what we can do is we can just say vue.use. and then you can say plugin. And basically what will happen now is that Vue would actually just call the install function underneath and then set up whatever logic that you want to do or add. So just to test, we can just see if it actually calls it. Console, cool. Okay, so it calls it. And basically, all a plugin really does in Vue is it just packages like common things that you might do in your application. Like, for example, if you want to add a mixin, you do it like that. If you want to add a directive, a filter, and so forth. But in this case, you would want to use a mixin because we want to apply whatever logic that we want to do to all our components across the application. So if you've used the mixin before, it's basically, it takes the same options API as any other component. So for example, you can use before, mount, you can have data, you can have methods. So then the mixin will just add that to any instance of a Vue component. And then you can access these things through the plugin. So this is a very simple example, but let's say we have our script. And we have some data. Let's call this version of the app, for example, and let's call it version 0.0, and then we can template it in. So we should see the version number, but just for the sake of it, or in this case, let's just say that you have some values here that you don't want to ever be updated or changed or modified or anything of that sort. But if I do this, for example, mounted, just set timeout. Let's make it 2 seconds. Then what you can do is you can say version equals 2.0.0. And then what should happen is it should change, but you don't want this kind of value to change because it's the version. You don't want the actual application to change it. So what we could do is we could create our own concept of constants in Vue. So data that doesn't really change. And we also want to make this available to the template as well. So what we could do is we can just remove this, and then we can create a constants. We can return a version 1.0.0. So now stuff will break because it doesn't exist, right? So basically what we want to do is we want to be able to take this method of constants, which doesn't actually exist in Vue, and we want to actually add this to the instance and then make it available to the template. So we'll probably need to write a plugin to make this kind of custom stuff work. So what we can do is we can get started. So we can do this and say before create. And then what we should be able to do is we should be able to access the instance of all the components that are being rendered. Yeah, so there should be two. This is the actual app.vue file. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can see. Is this big enough?
It looks big enough on my side.
Cool. Yeah, so this is the root Vue instance, and then this is the actual app.vue file, the Vue component that gets in. That's a child of the root instance. So you'll notice that if you look through the instance, there's something called $options. So $options basically refers to this exported object. That's what they refer to as the options API. So the options is what actually gets converted into an instance of a Vue component. So you can like go through here and you can like look for, is it this one? Yeah, so this is the options. Is this the right one? Or is it this one? Sorry, might be this one. Trying to find this thing. It's supposed to be but anyway, I can't see it there, but I should be able to access it before create. Let's see. I'll do this. There. Okay. Cool. I just couldn't see it in the actual console. So now we have access to this constants function. And then what we can do is we can just do this for safety. Because it is undefined at some point. Cool. So what we can do is we can do to access the instance of Vue as well. And then what you should do is you should be able to get the actual object back. Let's see. Yeah, cool. And then what we can do is we can just do a object.define. Oh, sorry, not yet. And then we can do object dot entries. Yeah. Each. I think it's key and then value. Yeah. Object.define property. So now what we can do is we can use, once we have the values from constants, we can add it as we can define a new property under this and we can set it so it's not writable or configurable. Anything of that sort. Key, enumerable, false, writable. Yeah, I think that this might break, but let's just do this in case. Hopefully nothing broke. Cool, and it actually seems to be working. So you'll see that there's, it shows the version. If I change, it should work as well. Yeah. So now, what if we try to do this? If we try to update it, or if anything else updates it. The start version equals 0 after 3 seconds. So hopefully we should see an error in the console, I hope. Cool, version of object. So we basically created a custom like helper for common things that we really need in the project. So this is actually something we've implemented ourselves as a custom helper in the Vue model itself, because we have a lot of like custom like constants like the stuff that we do. So we have like custom values or component names, and so we can use those names with our E2E stuff. Yes, updated. Yeah, so that's like the basics of like how to create a simple helper or a plugin for Vue. Yeah.
Cool. So there was a question about whether you can extract these into mixins, but I assume you did answer that just now, correct?
I'm not too sure.
So the question just reads, in this case, you can extract them into mixins as well. In mixins as well.
Oh, you mean the logic itself for the plugin?
I assume so.
Yes, you could. Yes, that this plugin does make use of a mixin basically. So all plugins that you use in Vue basically uses a mixin in the plugin itself. It's a question that I get quite often is, why would I need to create a plugin versus why can't I just do it as a mixin? Basically, the interface for the plugins, for example, is more well known, if that makes sense, across Vue developers. So what I mean is that people are more accustomed to doing something like this. For example, yeah, like what I did here, we import the plugin and then you say vue.use to include the logic, versus, for example, let's say there was a plugin mixin here. Mixin. Instead of doing this kind of thing. So plugins in most cases is used for if you want to package your custom logic into a npm package. But in most cases, if you're doing this kind of small thing, you could use it as a mixin. or just as a standalone mixin. But then what if you're doing stuff like custom directives, you know, or maybe you're including filters as well, custom filters. So this is a nice like way to package all this extra stuff and make it distributable. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
So then there's another question as well, and that is, do you find any kind of overhead in hot reloading after this model API?
Sorry, after that?
After this model API?
Any issues?
Yeah, I assume, so overhead, so I assume performance overheads, or yeah, I guess so, performance overhead. So does it slow down hot module reloading?
Not that of not to the point that it's noticeable at all. We've probably never experienced any issues with anything to do with hot reloading. Yeah, we've never experienced something like that yet, and we have quite a bit of pages at this point, so nothing noticeable. That's what I can say.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so you're specifically referring to Lumkani.
Yes, yes. There's
Yeah,
nothing.
cool. Yeah, and that's quite a big web app. So yeah, so I guess so. That kind of answers the question. Yes.
Mm.
So we don't have any more questions at the moment. If anyone is keen to pop one, just use the text chat. Shannon, I don't know if there's anything else you guys maybe want to cover.
There is something I would like to just go over quickly regarding the actual plugin itself. So we have some documentation available if anyone wants to check it out. But I do think that the biggest change, or the change that has the most impact for us, was introducing this concept called modifiers, which is a bit convoluted in a way, because it's plugin for the plugin itself. So what I mean is that with the release of version 3, we didn't want any coupling of non-view concepts included into the plugin itself. So I mentioned before, like, okay, we wanted to remove Vuex from the plugin, we want to remove Vue router. We wanted nothing to do with like ViewLidate or any packages that doesn't belong in Vue itself. So we needed some way to be able to implement and make it accessible through the ViewModel API that we developed. So we basically came up with an API for doing just that, where you can write custom stuff on top of the ViewModel API, and you still get it in the same way through the same interface. I mean, so here's an example of some code that adds Vuex, or an abstraction for using Vuex, but through the ViewModel and to the options API. There's some nice helper methods that doesn't exist in Vue, like add to computed. So this does all the merging for you, checks the merge conflicts, for lack of a better word, does all that for you, just to make it a bit smoother, to including your own logic. And besides this, I think the biggest thing that might be a question on some people's minds is that the design decisions for the ViewModel API was that it should always be something that's additive. So for example, it's more of a progressive enhancement in a way. So you could, if you want, you can write stuff in the using the ViewModel API, but you can also have stuff that's still written in the normal options API kind of way. So set item, start to-dos. So there's sort of like this compatibility between the two as well. So the ViewModel API manages the what you call it. So basically, like knows, okay, there is something there called methods. We can handle that and we can merge it together. Yeah, so anything that you do here still is valid. It doesn't mean that the ViewModel API replaces the options API completely, which is a very important one for us because we were still migrating slowly and there was still a lot of logic that was in the options API that we needed to work with the ViewModel eventually. So this was a big win for us and a win for the people that's actually like using it now in their own projects and things like that. Yeah. Any questions, perhaps?
That seems to be it. So maybe.
Yeah, cool. So I guess.
Mhm.
Yep.
So unless there's anything else you guys maybe want to cover, like we can probably close this off then.
Yeah, I'm happy. Dinesh, is there anything from
No,
your
I
side,
think
perhaps?
this last point was important. I had forgotten that. Yeah, it was very nice.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Skull.
Cool, no worries. Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, so I had a look at the spectrum. Seems like it's probably easier if we just continue with the Zoom text chat going forward. Jonathan made a pretty good suggestion that we can actually look into. But yeah, thanks everyone for all the questions. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick announcement. Let me just share my screen quickly. Can you guys see mine?
Yeah.
Okay, so just for the upcoming meetup, so Justin actually published it this morning. So the next talk we're going to have is Justin is going to do a talk on typography. I highly recommend joining this one. I often say that Justin is kind of like my typography guy. So if I have any questions about web typography at font face and so forth, I generally Slack him a message. So yeah, I highly encourage anyone to join this if they are interested in typography on the web. But then just before that, we have a live Q&A with Chris Coyer, who some of you guys might know. He's kind of the brains behind CSS Tricks, and he also is quite heavily involved in CodePen and also Shop Talk Show, which he does with Dave Rupert. So that is the 24th, which, let me have a look. That is actually exactly in a week. But that just note that is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So yeah, so I'm hoping you can join us for that one. So yeah, all of our events can be found on our meetup page. I need to update the URL still, but let me just see. Yeah, you can just search for FedSA Meetup, and you should find it. Cool. So if anyone has any questions about this specific talk, we also have a channel on ZA Tech just called FedSA. So you can probably just pop in there and ask any additional questions if you have. Shailen's pretty active on there, so he'll probably respond right away. Yeah, I think that covers everything from my side. Shailen, anything else from your side?
Cool. I thought it'd be nice to mention that it was Dinesh's first time doing a presentation in English.
Nice.
The native Portuguese speaker from Brazil.
Nice. Well done.
So maybe a nice virtual clap.
Thanks.
And
Yeah, it's a bit different, I must say.
Yeah, my English is also my second language, so I feel your pain. Yeah.
Cool, man. Thanks, Dinesh. You did good.
Cool.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see you then next Wednesday.
Thanks, gents.
Cool.
Cheers.
See you guys.
Cheers,
Bye.
everyone.